All right, welcome everyone. This is Connecting Research and Spending to Impact Stories with IRIS Reports. I'm Lauren Grossman. I'm the Communications and Membership Coordinator at IRIS, and I'm joined by Dharma Ackman, the Managing Director, and Kevin Bjorn, our Technical Director. So I'm just going to give it a minute for people to join, and then I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so I'm going to start talking a little bit about IRIS and our reports. So IRIS is a national consortium of leading research universities using data to understand, explain, and improve the value of higher education research. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about two reports that can be used to get insights about the value of research and use those in different communications. IRIS securely collects data, university administrative data on research spending and employment and purchasing, and we turn these into reports and data products like this portal that members can use to demonstrate how research drives innovation, supports jobs, and strengthens communities across the country. We also produce the de-identified IRIS metrics dataset, and this is available to research for research purposes by researchers, and this is anchored all on an IRB approved repository at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research. So today we're going to walk through these reports. I'm going to do a brief overview of each report. So we're going to start in this view, and then we're going to walk through some use cases. I'm going to share some real examples, and then we'll also leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. However, we have a bit of limited time, so I want to encourage you, please use the Q&A feature, put some questions in there. Kevin and Dharma will be responding to those throughout the demo. So this portal I'm going to show you, this demo, it's using University of Michigan's IRIS data. They've given us permission to use this for demonstration purposes. We do not do this for our other IRIS members, but we thank University of Michigan for letting us show off their reports. And so each of these reports gives you a different view into your research spending. We collect all the data, administrative data that goes into research. So every time you get a grant, you are purchasing things, hiring people, getting subcontracts out. And we can pull this administrative data and then connect the dots between research investments and the everyday value that people and businesses and economies get thanks to research spending. We use this, or members use this in their communications and public relations, a lot in state and federal relations, and then as well as like wider communications. So you'll see two reports today, the vendor report and the impact finder. And I'm going to start with just a brief overview of each report. So the vendor report gives you a very high level overview of the vendors that provide research related goods and services. So this report includes information on direct expenditures with businesses and organizations in the US, including subaward payments. These can be on federal or non-federal awards, but we do not include payments to individuals. So as a result, this slice of data might look slightly different from your other IRIS reports, but it really focuses on the vendor and subawardee data. And this has 3 pages. The first page focuses on these bigger numbers about the number of vendors you support and the total spending. And we look at this at the national, state level for your state and for small businesses. And we provide a overview year by year, an aggregate view, as well as a selectable view for snapshots, annual snapshots. We also provide a benchmarking section that benchmarks your data against all other IRIS members. So there is an aggregate version of this report in your portal. If you're an IRIS member, you can go in there and see who's included in that report. But in this case, we can see the majority of University of Michigan spending goes to in-state vendors, for example. The next page looks specifically at industry information. So what industries are your vendors in? And then also the methodology tab. And this is great just to review everything that goes into this report, how we make it. That provides really detailed information. So that's really a high level overview. And this report might look slightly different from what you've seen it before. If you've been an IRIS member, if you've seen us publish this report before, there are some different metrics in this version. We've also restructured it to use fiscal year and to do 5-year increments. So there are some neat updates with this one that are new this year. The next report is the impact finder. And so this lets you literally zoom in on research spending anywhere in the country. So this is a map-based tool, and it helps connect those high-level research spending data we saw in that first report to specific vendors that are benefiting from research spending and that make our research possible thanks to the goods and services they provide. So this is not a report, but this is an interactive map-based tool that lets you find out some really interesting things. So if you're working on communications and you want to find a vendor impact story, you want to learn more about the footprint of your research in your state or in another state, this is a really great tool. So this report lets you find research vendors based on county, based on the funding agency. We have federal and non-federal. You can look at filter for vendors or for subawards. And then the really unique thing about this report is that it lets you look at the actual awards that the payments to that vendor were made on. So not only can you see how much you spent with them, how many contracts there were, you can see the actual award number and get details about that research award. So all those fields coming into play, how much was spent, the award title, the PI, the award abstract. You'll see in this case that we didn't have the funder information in this one. We are constantly improving the data linking for this report, but you can see how this would give you a really great starting point to learn more about your research impact. So this report, it's this really great tool where it's the who, what, when, where, why of your research. And while it's not always comprehensive, it does let you search for keywords and terms. And that's a great starting point for pulling out a specific story. And that's actually what we're going to do for this next chunk of time. So I want to walk through some specific examples of how you might pull out data from the different reports and then connect them together for different cases where you might want to demonstrate how these public and private investments in research don't just stay on your campus, but instead support communities throughout your state. And I think a great place to start is just the state level impact. A common misconception is that research funding just stays on campus. In reality, those research dollars are immediately flowing out into communities through these purchases of goods and services, contracts. And so our IRIS members are often really interested in talking about their state level impact, and so that they can communicate that value out to different audiences. And so for this one, let's say you wanted to write an op-ed about the impact of research funding in your state. This has been in the news a lot. And so a great place to start would be the vendor report and pulling out these numbers about your in-state spending. So we can see in fiscal year 24, over 1,000 vendors were Michigan vendors at U of M, and over 184 million in research spending. And going down here again, we can see that, when compared to other IRIS universities, that Michigan does a lot of in-state spending. They have a quarter of all vendors are Michigan vendors, and half of research spending about is in Michigan. So with that information, then we want to look at the state itself. So here we have a map of Michigan and the impact finder. And let's say we have a lot of activity around Ann Arbor. There's a lot of research suppliers in Southeast Michigan. We have 4 leading research universities in the state, are in the state. And so I want to actually talk about how we reach the complete other side of the state, let's say for Michigan, for University of Michigan. So I'm actually going to look up Houghton County and apply that filter. And so we're all the way up here now. So this is about a 10-hour drive if you're if you're in Michigan going from Ann Arbor to Houghton. And so as you zoom in, you can actually see a cluster and it will give you the total. So right away you can see in Houghton County in fiscal year 24, there were 4 vendors, 821,000 in business spending with them. And then we get the list here. So some of these are probably subcontracts, but you can start scrolling around and getting ideas of like what might be an interesting thing to zero in on. And for me, my eye was immediately drawn to Calumet Electronics because if you are from Michigan, you know some Michigan history. The Calumet was like once the copper capital of the United States. They were huge mining industry here. So the fact that we now have an electronics company seemed interesting to me. And so I actually looked up their website and they talk about how after the last copper mines closed, they started this business. They talk about the number of people they employ and how they are providing career opportunities for the community. And so, it's kind of a unique case where we have, a business that has this special link to the area. And so, you could see how with a little research, you could connect these bigger picture numbers where it's, 1,000 businesses in Michigan supported this much funding, but to be able to put a face on it, so to speak, to be able to like call one out and then talk about how that business that you support with your research funding is also a key employer in that particular county is really compelling. And so you can do this with like a few different types of businesses, and try to talk about your impact throughout the state. And we actually did this recently in an op-ed that Iris co-published with the Research Universities for Michigan Alliance of, in Michigan, this is the alliance of MSU, Wayne State, U of M, and Michigan Tech. And we worked with them to talk about the different types of vendors that supply research and provide their skills and that would also feel the pinch if research funding was cut. And they talk about the different industries they're in. And it's just a great piece to talk about the kind of the footprint of research. And speaking of industries, then I think that's a great segue into let's say we want to talk about in the state or in general, how does research support businesses that are in key industries in our state or in our area of focus? And another great way, let's see, let's go back to our big map here. So that second tab of the vendor report is a great place to start for this. So this is your vendor spending that we were able to match to specific industries. So you'll notice if you have a report in front of you, the number at the top is going to be slightly different than the number on the first page because we can't always match 100% of vendors to industries, but we can get most of them. And so let's say you want to talk about how you support a specific industry, and manufacturing is a big one in Michigan. That's, I think, maybe the top contributor to the state's GDP. So you can see the past 5 years of spending in manufacturing. And you can click on that and drill down and get more detail. But what's really interesting is when you click on it, you get all these additional information just for that industry. So we can see, for example, 147 Michigan businesses received about $4 million in the past 5 fiscal years that were in manufacturing. So that's a big support for businesses in Michigan. And again, jumping back over, we want to find an example of that. So I did a little research about manufacturing businesses. I learned about something called electrical discharge machining. So I'm actually going to plug that EDM into the search bar to narrow things down a bit. And because that other report looked at 5 fiscal years, I'm also going to change this one to look at 5 fiscal years as well. Give it a second. There we go. So you can see we have a few of these pop up right away. And I want to look at this top one. I can see in the past 5 years, they've had 25 contracts, almost $100,000. And again, if you kind of take that extra step to do a little bit of extra research, you can learn more about that business. So I looked up their website and they actually talk about what that process is, the kinds of manufacturing it supports, automotive, obviously a big one in Michigan, and just how they are contributing to that specialty in manufacturing. So again, great context if you're looking for a story. But, you know, another thing that we could do if we want to go even further is look beyond just like the spending totals and the business profiles and take advantage of what's really special about this tool, which is the abstract data. So I want to look at what research is this supporting. So there's a lot of business being done with this in this manufacturing group of businesses. What can we learn about it? So I just filtered it down. We lost a couple of results because not all of them had abstracts, but that's all right. We still have a lot. And let's see here. So let's say, okay. So this one gives you a lot of information, gives you the payment that was made on which grant. It tells you it was an NSF grant. It gives you the proposal number, the award number. It gives you the PI. And then at this point, you have to do a little bit of reading. But what's really interesting about this one is that it's a grant about essentially, it even describes it here, talking about how patterns form in metals when they solidify. And he's basically saying it's key to understanding or controlling the manufacture of advanced materials from the bottom up. So now you have this really interesting story where you're talking about manufacturing, you're talking about the businesses you support in the state, and then you have an example of a business you support in that industry. But not only are you supporting them, the the research they're supplying supplies to is actually helping under advance the scientific understanding of that industry, so that will allow manufacturing to improve. So that's a really interesting case where it's mutually supportive. And so you can see how you could do this with a couple different things. You could search not just business names, you could also look for keywords that might be specific to your university. So I don't know if we have any Michigan State people on the call, but they have this the FRIB, which is the Facility for Rare Isotope Beams. That would be a great thing to punch into the search bar. University of Wisconsin-Madison has a magnetic resonance facility. So if you were interested in looking up the vendor impact of grants relating to magnetic research, that would be another thing you could do. In Michigan, we're doing a lot with autonomous vehicles. So you can see throughout the state here. Here's one with a quantum signal AI. And they're talking about, advancing, autonomous transportation research. So Michigan, obviously huge for automotive. The next wave is electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles. And so this is a great connection to that where you could talk about that vendor. And then the next thing I want to point out too is that with each of these vendors, you can also, look at just the breadth of research they support. And a lot of the vendors aren't these huge manufacturers, they're small businesses. So that's another angle you could pursue. Again, going back to the vendor profile report, you have the information about how many small businesses received research spending. And this isn't specific to your state, but it gives you that idea of like we do have significant spending with small businesses. And if you know the name of one that you want to look up and you do business with them, that's a great thing to do to dig in a little bit more. And I love this example. Oops. Uh-oh. Go back to the impact finder here. But essentially, there's a great example of a dry ice supplier. When you look it up, it looks like an ice cream shop. but when you look at them, they're supplying dry ice to all these different projects. And so you have a small business that's in Flint, Michigan. It's a locally owned small business. When you go to their website, they talk about they supply dry ice to people when they lose power and that sort of thing. But they're also supporting all this research that's looking into medical treatments and manufacturing techniques. And so talking about the impact that just one business has, they have this huge research footprint, which is really compelling. And Another thing we can talk about too, which I kind of mentioned earlier, is that, these are the businesses that are impacted when we have things like federal funding cuts to research. And a lot of people are very interested in being able to talk specifically about federal research. And so you could look up, for example, and filter by federal funding. And these are all the vendors or subawardees, but you could filter by vendors if you'd like, and look at just the massive footprint this has across the state. And you could narrow it down as well. You could talk about just NSF funding in, Kent County in the last 5 years. And you can see all the different vendors, the different research they're doing. This one's for semiconductors. So just talking about that local impact that you can really narrow in federal funding or state funding. And then the last thing I want to point out too is that you can talk about the kind of the research network of, for example, subawards. And so, this is a case where, it's not like a family owned business, but they are still anchors in their community. They still, they reflect how research actually happens, which is through these very interconnected teams across all these institutions, universities, nonprofits, companies. And that really helps us tell that story about the nature of innovation, how collaborative it is. And we have a few minutes. I just want to briefly show you, I've been talking about some of these examples. So we have this press release or not press release, op-ed. It's a great example of talking about the impact of research on the state. Using that, we used Impact Finder data to actually pull out examples of specific vendors. This is an example from a few years ago when we first started doing the Impact Finder, but this is talking about one small vendor that supplied U of M with treadmills for babies for research about children with Down syndrome. And, they went and they interviewed the vendor and talked about how important that work was to him personally. This is an article from University of Utah. They talk about their small business impact in the state. And another recent one that was really great was Boston University did this great website where they talk about the impact of their research, the type of research they do, but also they included numbers about, here it is, like the impact, the investment in the community, and they use their IRIS numbers vendor report for these numbers. So it doesn't always have to be a combination with the story. There's a lot you can do just with these numbers themselves. But I think the real benefit is being able to take those big picture numbers and then connect them down to real stories, add a face to it. And so I'm going to pause there and stop sharing for a moment just to touch base and see if we have any questions that came in.
We answered all of them as they came in, so
Great.
I'm not sure if people have any others, but.
And one thing I'd like to point out too, which I didn't in the presentation, is that when you use the Impact Finder right now, you can filter by county. We are very soon going to roll out a feature where you can filter also by congressional district. Some of our other reports focus on congressional district spending or state legislative district spending as well. So this will be a feature that we're going to roll out in parts to the Impact Finder. So that'll be, I think, really impactful. If you're interested in learning more about IRIS and the reports, you can visit our website. If you are a member and you would like a kind of personalized walkthrough of your IRIS reports and what you can do with them, please reach out to us. We regularly schedule kind of sort of orientations with your team so you can help leverage these for government relations or different communication strategies. And we can also help you dig into your data. So if you're an IRIS member and you've submitted data to us, it goes through all this processes where it's linked and improved, and you have access to that. So there's a lot that we tell you in your reports, but there's a lot in the data itself, and we can help pull out some answers to questions if you have that are a little bit more specific.
And I see a couple more questions just rolled in. One looks like a good Kevin question. Does the business activity get reported by NAICS codes?
So it does. When we match the data to external data sets, one of the data points we make sure we include is all the NAICS codes for all the businesses. And we do it at the establishment level. So at the finest grain level that we can, the 6-digit NAICS. And then we use that to build the sunburst diagram in particular, where we organize all the expenditures by industries. So those industries are defined by their NAICS codes.
I had a question from John. Is it both state and federal congressional districts? Yes. And so for the impact finder, right now we're working on filtering by congressional district. We will then be working on state legislative districts down the road. But currently, right now, we also have reports for each of those things. So the state legislative fact sheet and the congressional district fact sheet. So those are available in your IRIS portal. Kevin, this is maybe a question for your team. Is it doable to export the data in Impact Finder to a CSV format?
So that's a funny question or an interesting question because I recently built a query in the system that lets us pull data out with all of the different political borders or districts defined in it as a CSV file. So it actually lists a lot of what you find in the impact finder as a CSV file. And it provides information like the county that the business is in, the congressional district, the state legislative district, the state Senate district, things like that. And all this is going to be used in the next improvement of the actual report interface. But if you want it, email us. I've been producing it for other universities, University of Utah recently, and also uh, Minnesota, University of Minnesota. Oh, and Wayne State University. So just ask us and we can set you up.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. I don't see any more questions come in. But I think that's all the time we have for today. So if there have any more questions that come up, please reach out to us. Again, there's a lot of great information in these reports. You know, research universities are really one of our nation's greatest assets, and there's a lot of interesting stories we can tell about how they have these immediately impactful uh, things that happen in everyday life from businesses and local communities, training the next generation of scientists. There's a lot in these reports that can be combined to tell these really compelling stories. So we'd love to work with you on those. And thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.